In this video, I want to discuss my study on how the Torah refers to the subject of lethal violence. In doing so, I wanted to go over some of the events that took place with the Exodus and in the wilderness, and I also wanted to cover different legal aspects of it as referred to in the laws present in the Torah and its legal system. Whenever I went into this study, I had some questions because there seemed to be some inconsistent ways in how the law addressed this subject. There are some statements, which I'll get into, that seem to take a pretty decisive stance on the issue if we take them literally. But there are other statements and events which seem to go against that literal interpretation. So I personally do not hold that this is an entirely simple or explicit issue. Just like with a lot of issues and just like with a lot of people, I had my personal inclinations surrounding this topic, and before I became concerned with the Torah and its position on morality, I had my own views on what the morality hypothetically was on this issue, which were informed by my culture that I was raised in rather than being informed directly by the Torah. So the first issue was recognizing, and I know this is obvious, that the Torah may take a different angle to this from my previous belief. So instead of just looking for validation, what I wanted to do was research what the text says. I wanted to try to understand the overall reconciled picture based upon all of these instances in the law. Just like with anything, while trying to diminish my personal biases, I'm sure that they unintentionally may come out in one way or another in the way I looked at this issue, but my attempt was to try to see what the Torah said on this issue and try to understand it from within that frame. To start off with, I wanted to briefly highlight some of the events described in the narrative surrounding the law. On some of these, I will return to them whenever I begin talking about specific words used in the text, but for now I wanted to use them to set the frame for looking at the specifics of the law. I think it's worth noting that if these events were not actually in the narrative of the law, I would not consider them to be particularly relevant. There are a lot of things that go on in the narrative of the Tanakh which are not in line with the law, and there are examples where such deviations from the law are even condoned. However, in the cases that I'm going to go through, most of them are connected with the law and the giving of the law in one way or another because they often involve commands being given through Moses, even if some are just connected with those specific people at that time. Ultimately, when it comes to looking at examples, I think we should be cautious. However, depending upon how you look at it, some of these could be considered part of the law themselves. Therefore, I'm less hesitant to include them than I would be with any other type of example. The first one is toward the beginning of the book of Exodus, before the direct interaction between Moses and Elohim. In Exodus 2, Moses witnesses someone smiting one of his brethren, and Moses apparently kills the guy doing it as a result. It could be seen as not 100% explicit that he killed him, but based on him hiding the guy in the sand and based on his subsequent accusation against him that he killed the man, and then Moses being concerned that people found out what he did, I think the indication is pretty clear. This event takes place before the law was being delivered, and there's not any real moral commentary given on it or discussion of it otherwise. But immediately after, it says that Pharaoh heard about what he did and wanted to kill him, so Moses fled. And then later, Elohim tells him it is safe to return because the people that were seeking his life died. I found it interesting that Elohim seems to be, at least in some way, protecting him from the fallout of that situation, though I would not draw any conclusions from that alone. In Exodus 17, we have the situation with Amalek. As the people are coming out into the wilderness, they were attacked by Amalek. It then says in verse 9 that Moses ordered an army to be mustered to fight against them, and then they eventually defeated them. In verse 14, it says that Elohim told Moses he will wipe out the remembrance of Amalek. It goes on to say at the end of the chapter is that essentially Elohim has a war against Amalek from generation to generation. So the retaliation against their attack was apparently supported by Elohim in this passage. Next, I want to look at the aftermath of the gold calf incident. In Exodus 32, the Israelites made a gold calf and were worshiping it, and Moses came down from the mountain and saw what was going on. He then called for the people who were loyal to Elohim to gather with him, and then he told them that Elohim commands them to essentially go through the camp and kill their fellows, and that is what they did. This particular part of the story is not really dwelled upon further, but immediately after, Moses suggests that their actions were approved of by Elohim. There is another example of violence in Leviticus 24:10, but very little is said about that part of the story, and it does not appear to involve lethal violence. Although there are laws on violence which are given following it, which I will address later, the emphasis in this passage appears to be the cursing aspect of that incident, where it says the one man involved cursed the name. At the end, it does specify that the one man was commanded to be executed by stoning, and that is what they did. It says that all of the congregation was supposed to be involved, and that all that heard him were supposed to initiate by laying their hands upon his head. It is conspicuous to me that the laying of the hands is the same wording as appears with many of the offerings, and it also reminds me of various passages which I will address, which mention the blood being upon those responsible for certain actions, rather than the blood being upon those doing the punishment, as I infer from Leviticus 20, etc. That is not explicit in this passage, but there certainly could be a connection there. In Numbers 21, Israel begins to fight some of the people of the land, and later in the chapter they fight with Sihon after he attacks them. It says they put him to the edge of the sword and essentially conquered his territory. Of course, this is getting into the issue of the Canaanites and the other inhabitants of the land, which Elohim had already said he was going to drive out and destroy, and about which he had already said that they should not be allowed to dwell in Israel's land. In Numbers 25, there appears to be an incident similar to the gold calf situation. Israel begins to worship a foreign god, and then in verse 4, Elohim commands Moses to kill the heads of the people, and it says to impale them or hang them or something else. It's not entirely clear the meaning of this word. And then Moses gives the judges an order similar to what we see in Exodus 32 with the gold calf, that they are to kill each man his men. Whenever one of the sons of Israel comes before the people, apparently flaunting his behavior, Phinehas rises up and kills them, and that apparently led to the plague being restrained. Afterward, Elohim says that the action covered over the sins of Israel, or in other words, atoned for them. It emphasizes that he was acting out of jealousy for Elohim, essentially on behalf of his jealousy. Finally, I wanted to look at Numbers 31. Elohim commands Moses to take revenge on Midian. Moses then tells the people to prepare for battle, and then it says that they killed all the men. One thing that I found of interest in this passage was the portion from verses 19 to 24, a part of which literally specifies that it is a part of the Torah. It says that the people that went into battle and killed someone or touched a body are supposed to cleanse themselves. The word used is a form of the word which is typically translated as to sin, but that is not the only way it is used. The intensive form is sometimes used to refer to making an offering, which is sometimes referred to as a sin offering, even though it is effectively the same word as committing a sin. And the reflexive form is sometimes used for purifying oneself or cleansing oneself from sin, hypothetically. I wanted to bring this up because a view may come up that recognizes sin being an inherent part of what they did, even though it was a part of what they were told to do. I think that is debatable because cleansing from sin, or the purifying, depending on how you look at it, is also being done for their possessions in verses 20 through 23. Of course, there are always other ways of looking at things, but in my view, inanimate objects don't really do anything. So the idea that an inanimate object itself could have sinned seems incorrect to me. If we have the view that contact with these people or their possessions had a defiling aspect to it, then sure. But if that's the view, then the same could be said for the army simply making contact with those same people rather than it being about their personal actions in the army. One could also compare the purification ritual with the red heifer commands. I think it's possible that this word in question doesn't literally indicate sin, but instead the more basic meaning may be to go astray or something like that. That's one of the ways that it is used, so it is a possibility. Sin may be a sort of extended meaning from go astray, since it would be going astray morally, and similarly, purify could be a separate extended meaning from go astray, and maybe derived from the sense of causing oneself to withdraw or to set something aside or even to set the defilement aside. This is just hypothetical, but I think there is a case that could be made for that. My underlying point about the word, about this passage, is that this implication of sin may not be there in that inherent way. Those are some of the examples that could be relevant from the narrative. We have Moses and the man he hid in the sand, the Amalek incident, the gold calf incident, the cursing incident, the Sihon war, the impaling incident, and the war with Midian. One might be inclined to categorize these incidents as incidents of war, incidents of apostasy and similar behavior, and the single incident of Moses essentially defending another person. Maybe someone else could put a different frame around this, but from how I'm looking at these events, it's clear that violence was used as a solution for many problems. It even says they were told to do that at times, and of course, there's also the clear expectation of that when they approached the land. While law or direction from Elohim accompanies or is given in accordance with some of these events, keep in mind that the specifics of the commands in general have yet to be looked at, so that's what I want to go into now. Getting into the actual commands, I want to start off with the one that everyone knows from the 10 Commandments or the 10 words, Exodus 20:13. You're probably already aware of how the King James Version translates it as, "Thou shalt not kill," and while many of the more modern versions translate it as, "You shall not murder." If you look into how this word ratzach is used, you may notice that it appears to only be used in reference to people, and it is actually not used exclusively for murder. In order to look at this sufficiently, we need to go through Numbers 35, where this word is used repeatedly for accidental manslaughter. Numbers 35:11 specifies this clearly, so we will start from there. In that verse and others, it uses a form of ratzach in reference to the person that did the act of killing someone inadvertently, the manslayer. So if we rigidly translated this as murder in all cases, we would have him being referred to as a murderer, even though he killed unintentionally. There are several examples similar to this throughout the chapter and in other parts of the Torah also. Since we're here, I wanted to highlight some of the commands in this chapter while we are looking at this word. Since this is one of the longer passages, I'm going to temporarily use the words manslayer and manslaughter for the word in question, but I will discuss that in more detail as we go. As mentioned, we have verse 11, which describes the manslayer that inadvertently kills someone fleeing to one of the cities of asylum. In verse 12, it goes on to say that he needs to stand for judgment, and it says that this applies to the sons of Israel and also the sojourner and the one dwelling in their midst. And it refers to them as anyone smiting a being in error. In the next few verses, it makes an interesting statement that I'm going to circle back to. It describes smiting a person with an article of iron, or seemingly with wood or stone tools, and with all of them it says the person is a manslayer, and that the manslayer shall be caused to die. Then in verse 19 it says that the Redeemer of the blood may perform the execution as he encounters him. The next few verses are similar to the previous in that they specify other reasons that the person would be considered guilty, such as attacking him in hatred or lying in wait for him. In verses 22 and 23, it gives circumstances which would qualify as accidental killing and may not be punished, such as something that happens in the moment, or wasn't premeditated, or was completely unintentional. Then it says in verse 24 that the congregation is going to make the judgment on this situation. If they decide that he's not worthy of death, then he is placed in the city of asylum and has to stay there until the death of the high priest. However, in verse 27, if the person is found by the Redeemer of the blood outside the city, then he may manslaughter the manslayer without blood for him. This issue of blood I will address further shortly. In verse 30, it says that anyone smiting a being to the decree of witnesses, he shall manslaughter the manslayer, and one witness shall not answer against a being to die. Some have pointed out that this is one of the only examples of the word being used in a context of legal authorization or legal command. In verse 31, it says that there cannot be any ransom for the killer who is guilty or wicked, but that execution is the only way. Then in verses 33 and 34, there are more references to the blood. It says that the blood corrupts the land, and it indicates that the blood of the one who spilled the blood is what covers over the blood that was spilled. The first thing I wanted to address about this passage is the use of the word in question, which also appears in Exodus 20. There appears to be a distinction made in this passage that indicates the word has two different meanings based on context. On the one hand, we have this example of the person who does the accidental killing, and then it goes on to explain the judgment of that person in verses 22 through 25 and otherwise, and it says that he'll be delivered from the Redeemer of the blood and will not be executed for what he did. On the other hand, in verses 16 through 21 and 30 through 33, it refers to the person who is at fault for a killing, and it states that the guilty one will be executed as a result. Interestingly, even though the manslayer smiting a being in error in verse 11 is called a roseach, when verses 16 through 21 provide examples of fault for a killing, they repeatedly state, he is a roseach, and the roseach shall surely be caused to die. Even though both are called the same thing, it was apparently important to explicitly specify a guilty killer as a roseach with the phrase, he is a roseach. Despite being identical words, one who is manslaying is apparently not always the same as one who is manslaying. There are two types of manslayers in this passage. The manslayer which is given asylum and is not considered wicked or guilty, and the manslayer which he is a manslayer, and as a result, the manslayer shall surely be caused to die. The passage itself, at least the way I'm looking at it, seems to highlight that there are at least two different meanings to this word, which include manslaughter in general and murder more specifically. There are a few other times this word is used in the law, which I want to discuss. In Deuteronomy 4:42, in reference to this same context of fleeing to the city of asylum, it refers to the manslayer fleeing toward there, which shall manslaughter his companion unknowingly. And he was not hating him from the day before yesterday, and he shall flee to one of these cities, and he shall live. The first thing is the phrase day before yesterday, which appears to be an idiom that can refer to times past in general. Also, there is this new distinction when compared with the Numbers 35 passage regarding manslaughtering unknowingly, or in being without awareness or knowledge. In addition to the new distinction of manslaughter his companion, with companion being one's neighbor or comrade, often used in reference to one's own people. With this passage, it appears to be confining this issue to one's companion, neighbor, comrade, or possibly countryman. This is repeated in Deuteronomy 19:4. Without going into all of Deuteronomy 19, since much of it repeats what we have already looked at, I'll highlight some points from it. It gives a new example in verse 5 about accidental killing, and then in verse 6 it uses a new phrase in reference to the inadvertent manslayer that says, "For him was no judgment of death." Later in verse 10 it refers to how innocent blood shall not be spilled in the midst of your land, and it refers to such as being blood on you. Take note of some of these mentions of blood for now. Then in verse 11 it specifies a man hating his companion. Note the use of companion again. At the end it refers to executing him, and it says that you shall expel the blood of the innocent from Israel. So presumably this killing of the manslayer is connected with the expelling of the blood of the innocent, as we will get into. Those are most of the examples of this word being used in the law. Take note of the context that this word is used in, and one thing I would note is that many, if not all of these situations, appear to involve people of the community, or at least some of them specify that explicitly. The next issue that has already been alluded to in some of these verses is the issue of blood. Blood in these cases goes beyond physical blood and is mentioned a number of times in these types of contexts, just like we've already seen. Blood is commonly translated as blood guilt when it appears in this type of context, although it is simply the same as the literal word for blood. Blood guilt in English can have connotations to it that aren't necessarily present with this, but I think it is correct to assume that there is some type of guilt associated with it. Let's consider some of these examples that we've already looked at. As we saw earlier with the laws addressing and distinguishing between accidental killing and murder, they often involve the redeemer of the blood. Also, we saw in Numbers 35:27 that the redeemer of the blood is authorized to manslaughter the manslayer if he is not abiding by the asylum laws. And in that event, it says that there is no blood for him. This phrase appears a number of times, especially in the context of punishment, as well as the context that we looked at earlier in Deuteronomy 19. In verse 10, it refers to how innocent blood being shed in your land brings blood upon you. In verses 12 and 13, it says that the redeemer of the blood should be allowed to kill the one who shed the innocent blood. And apparently as a result, it causes the innocent blood to be expelled from upon Israel. There are a few other examples that I want to point out, but I do not intend to get into every instance because this concept of the blood could easily be its own study. For some additional reading, if you're interested, there's the passage in Genesis 4:10 through 11 with the first murder, which could have some interesting implications to other issues depending on how you read it. And there are the statements about the life or the being in the blood in Leviticus 17. There's also the statement in Genesis 9:5-6 about how one shedding the blood of a human shall have his blood shed by a human, or depending on how you read it, you may place emphasis on how it says, from the hand of each man of his brother I shall inquire. However, I want to focus on the statements that are in a few of the commands of the laws given explicitly through Moses. So for now, I wanted to just point out that there are a number of other statements that involve this concept. In Exodus 22, verses 1 and 2 or 2 and 3, it refers to the thief breaking in at night versus in the daytime. It says that if he is struck and dies, then there is no blood for him. However, if the sun has risen on him, then there is blood for him. So if we assume this concept of guilt, which I think is fair, then there's a distinction in this specific context whether guilt is incurred or not. As to the implications of why it's not incurred at nighttime and why it is incurred during the daytime, this can easily get into a level of speculation or projection that I'm not comfortable with. It's certainly possible to devise a narrative for why this command exists as it does, regardless of the person's view on the overall issue. One who believes in a full right to kill in self-defense might think that the command provides this allowance because it's harder to ascertain whether the thief is truly just a thief and whether he is just intending to steal when he's breaking in at night. Whereas if he breaks in during the day, his intentions may be more obvious and one might better distinguish between a thief and a killer, kidnapper, etc. However, one who believes in a more pacifistic ideal might think, and this is a perspective I've heard before, that the distinction is there because it is harder to restrain someone in the dark than it is in daylight, or because an accident may be more likely to happen in that situation at night. Note that there is no such explanation in any direction in this passage. This is the issue with assuming the reason behind a command. If the command does not actually say it, then we need to be able to prove it through what other commands say. There are always explanations that exist which will make sense to other people. The command is definitely of interest with regard to self-defense and the issue of blood, but it alone does not provide the answers. A series of mentions of the blood appears in Leviticus 20. This chapter lists a number of infractions which it addresses with capital punishment. For example, verse 9 refers to scorning of father and mother, and it says that the person's bloods are upon him. We see similar statements as we go through the chapter, such as with different prohibited relationships. These verses refer to blood being upon or in a guilty party who committed a violation. If we assume the concept of blood guilt, the guilt for their death appears to be placed upon themselves because of the action they did. When the judgment is done and the execution is performed, the blood apparently is on those doing the violation rather than those performing the execution. To go along with this, one may consider Deuteronomy 17:6-7 in reference to capital punishment, requiring witnesses in the action of the people rather than one individual, at least generally speaking. There are more verses in addition to these which speak similarly. The last one I wanted to mention for now is Deuteronomy 22:8. It refers to the blood being brought upon a house if a person falls from an unsecured roof terrace. By the way, as an aside, that is my current understanding of the word here for roof, that it probably refers to a roof terrace or flat roof rather than simply any roof. And this is coming from a person, namely me, that had put a railing around his house prior to coming to that understanding. So getting back to the blood from such an accident can apparently still be placed upon either the house or the household, depending on how you read that. Apparently, there are some cases when bloodshed brings about blood, or as we might infer, blood guilt. On the other hand, there are situations when the blood is explicitly placed upon the party that is being killed, such as we saw in references to capital punishment and also seemingly the actions of the Redeemer of the blood in some cases. Personally, I wonder about other examples which do not have this issue of blood explained or specified. For example, it doesn't mention in Deuteronomy 13, and it doesn't mention it in regard to war. One might assume that if something is allowed or commanded, that blood guilt is not going to be incurred. The text doesn't really give a detailed explanation of that, in my opinion. So those are the examples I wanted to mention to give us kind of an idea of that topic as it is mentioned in some of these commands. Next, I want to get into the word for smite, which is nakah. This word is pretty common throughout the text, and there are a number of potentially relevant commands that use it. The meaning of this word is somewhat flexible. Sometimes it just means striking or injuring. Other times it refers to killing or lethally striking, and other times it is used metaphorically, such as with plagues. This is one of the words used in the passage we looked at earlier, with Moses apparently killing the man that was beating one of his brethren. The reason why some assume that maybe he didn't actually kill the man, even though the narrative otherwise indicates that he did kill him, is because it uses this word. Sometimes it is a lethal strike, sometimes it's not. We can see an example of a non-lethal strike in Exodus 21:18-19. It uses the same word. If there is a fight between two fellows, note that it says, "A man shall smite his companion," and then the man is injured, but apparently not killed. Then the one causing the injury is obligated to compensate the injured party. So clearly it doesn't just mean to kill. However, there are times when it does refer to that, or it does refer to that which results in it. In Exodus 21:12-15, we have another distinction between accidental killing and murder. The passage starts off with referring to smiting a man and he shall die. So the general response to killing is apparently capital punishment. In the next verses, it gives some exceptions like we've seen already. If the person did not lie in wait and instead it was an act of God in some sense, then he is going to the city of asylum. In verse 14, it says that if a man shall become heated or act arrogantly or presumptuously, depending on how you render it, and then acts to kill his companion in craftiness, then he is being excluded from the altar. I took note of the fact that it specified companion here, as we saw a few times before. In verse 15, it uses the word for smite again in reference to one smiting his father and mother. This is a bit of an aside, but one thing I noticed that may be related to this prohibition is that in an earlier part of Deuteronomy 13, when punishment is being enacted, it excludes father and mother from that person's explicit responsibility. Continuing with the smiting, the latter portion of Deuteronomy 13, starting in verse 13 or 12, refers to the sons of worthlessness going forth from your midst in one of your cities. It refers to them serving other Elohim which you knew not, and compelling people to do it in their city. Then at the end it refers to smiting the inhabitants of the city with the edge of the sword. A similar wording appears in the passage we looked at where Sihon was defeated in battle, the smiting with the edge of the sword. So we have another example of action which we could compare with some of the incidents at the beginning of this presentation that we looked at, such as the gold calf incident. They are essentially to go to war with the city of Israel when it is turned away and defected. The last passage I wanted to mention in association with this word is one which has a fairly strong wording against lethal violence. Whenever I first began looking at this issue, I found this passage to be somewhat curious. There's one wording in particular at the beginning of it that's of interest. In Leviticus 24:17, it says that a man that shall smite any human being or any life of a human, he shall surely be caused to die or put to death. Note that it says any human being. So if we isolate that part and take it literally, then this is kind of a head scratcher when trying to reconcile that with what is said elsewhere and done elsewhere. The passage continues in the next verse talking about replacing a killed animal. Then it refers to, and I found this distinction interesting, a man giving a blemish in his associate. As far as I can tell, this word in Hebrew appears to refer to the community of Israel or the Israelite family. I also noticed this specification was emphasized in some of the traditional writings too. After that, the passage refers to the eye for an eye punishments. Then it reiterates the first part of the passage and says that a person smiting a beast shall repay it, and one smiting a human shall be caused to die. And this is said to apply to the sojourner and the native. So this passage is probably the most conspicuous with regard to lethal violence and what is allowed and what is not. I'll address my thoughts more fully at the very end of the presentation, but it's hard to isolate these two verses and take them completely literally when we have the context of many other passages we've looked at or will look at. For example, we just looked at a passage in Deuteronomy which commanded smiting the inhabitants of a city with a sword. So I would assume that means that one is smiting the life of a human by doing so, by going to war with a city and then just completely destroying it and everything and everyone in it. So not only do we have many other examples, but we have a verse that commands lethal smiting using that word, and another verse which says, at least in that verse by itself, that it prohibits lethal smiting against any human. Maybe there are parts of the surrounding verses which should be counted as context. Maybe the entire situation that these laws are given in response to should be considered context. Those are things to consider. I will return to this passage at the end. There's one more word that I wanted to look at, and then I'll close off with looking at some of the commands about war. There's another word used in the Torah for killing, and it consistently refers to just killing. It's the word used in the gold calf incident when Moses tells the faithful to kill each man his brother in the camp, as we looked at. It's also used in the situation with Phinehas and the apostasy of the people when Moses tells them to kill each man his men. It appears when they go to war with Midian and kill every male, and as alluded to before, it appears in Deuteronomy 13:10. One verse that we haven't looked at is Exodus 23:7. It says, "You shall be far from a matter of falsehood, and you must not kill an innocent and righteous one, for I shall not make right the wicked one." So in context, at least with the immediately surrounding verses, it appears to be referring to a matter of judgment, and it specifies that the one who is in the right and is innocent is not supposed to be killed. Also, if you're looking for contradictions with Paul, you might take note of the latter half of this verse also. So in terms of the study overall, this verse doesn't necessarily clarify much, but it is one of the relevant laws, so I wanted to include it. The last set of passages I wanted to bring up are laws regarding war. Of course, we know about the war with the Canaanites or the inhabitants of the land. There are a number of passages that say either Elohim is destroying them, driving them out, or dispossessing them, while at the same time it either implies that Israel is involved or it commands outright that they are involved. For example, in Numbers 33:52, it says that you shall dispossess all dwelling in the land, and 53 says you shall dispossess the land. Hypothetically, the inhabitants could just pack up and leave and just hand over the land, and hypothetically that'd be okay, but obviously that's probably an unrealistic expectation. In Deuteronomy 7, it talks about the conquest of these tribes and the possessing of the land. In verse 2, it commands explicitly about smiting them and devoting them, and we see some similarly decisive wordings in Deuteronomy 20:16 through 18. So we know about the situation with those tribes, and we also discussed a few wars with the examples at the beginning of this presentation. And there's also one other passage about war with other nations which I wanted to point out. In Deuteronomy 20, prior to the aforementioned discussion of the inhabitants of the land, it refers to besieging cities that are not of the tribes. If the city refuses the Israelites' army's request for peace and does not submit, then they begin to fight. In that case, it says they are smiting every male in verse 13. This is an example of fighting abroad, apparently, presumably not within the land and not against the condemned tribes and not against those formerly of the congregation, and apparently that is authorized in some sense. So we have not only the wars of immediate defense, such as with Amalek, and the wars of possessing the land, but we also have hypothetical other wars beyond that, and it does not clarify any required context for this either. So those are all the passages in the laws that I thought were particularly relevant to this study. I realize that's a lot to look at and consider, so I encourage you looking into this further. There are a lot of situations when Israel or the Israelites relied on violence to solve problems, and textually speaking, many of those times are either commanded or explicitly praised by Elohim. In my view, there's no way to reconcile those facts with a pacifistic view which some might try to project onto the text. Obviously, there's capital punishment. Also, we had multiple cases of going to battle or going to war with other nations, either in defense or in conquest. And there are commands about Israelites going to war against a city of their own people, or maybe more specifically against those that had gone forth from the people and abandoned Elohim. On top of that, there were some other battles against people that were in the congregation or used to be in the congregation, which went on or were instigated by Moses or by Elohim, such as the gold calf incident and the incident that Phinehas was involved in. Taking all of that into consideration while looking at these commands regarding violence, one thing I noticed was what could be considered a clarification that appears in a number of these verses regarding personal injury and murder, which I alluded to before. Here are 3 examples of that. Deuteronomy 4:42. It refers to the manslayer, and it specifies that he manslaughtered his companion. And that word frequently is used in reference to one's neighbor, comrade, or countryman. In Exodus 21:14, it refers to a man becoming heated against his companion, using that same word. Also, with Leviticus 24, we had the passage about smiting any human being, And in the midst of it, in verse 19, it refers to a man giving a blemish in his associate. This word appears to be used for people who are a part of the community of Israel. I found these specifications to be of interest. There are also a few others like this that have already been referred to along the way of the presentation. The conclusion that I think fits best with all that we have seen is that the laws regarding personal injury and lethal violence appear to be confined to people within the nation. Based on what goes on otherwise in the narrative of the law itself, and based on other laws which we have looked at, this seems to be the most logical reconciliation of the seemingly contradictory angles to the subject. With most of these laws regarding personal injury and lethal violence, there are references which accompany them that either specify people that are a part of the community or specify something that could be considered synonymous with that. On top of that, one might infer a general context of being within the confines of the commanded legal system. Clearly there is a reason they had things like city walls and armies, and that's even in the context of being in the land. I will draw our attention back to Leviticus 24 and the verses that led up to the commands that we looked at, wherein there was the fight between the two men within the congregation, and just because they were fighting, that didn't mean that they were allowed to escalate that automatically. But not every situation is like that situation. Not every fight is between people of the nation or people that are within the community, or however it is being framed. So, although that distinction is not completely explicit in the text, that is what I am seeing, and that seems to make the most sense to me across the contexts.